Hi, and welcome to Mr. Bowman's World History Pre-AP World History class. This will begin our year with SOL WHI.2. This is our prehistory part 1 video PowerPoint presentation. By now, you should have been able to print out the slot notes that correspond with this, and I will go through it one slide at a time, and you need to follow along and add the information to it into your Google Doc that you have downloaded and take the notes accordingly. So let's begin. Our early ancestors, or early humans, truly depended upon the physical environment. The area that surrounded them, the whether it was deserts, valleys, savannas, mountains truly had effect and shaped the lives of our early ancestors. The earliest species, known as Homo sapiens, emerged 100,000 to 400,000 years ago. Homo sapiens migrated from Africa to Eurasia, which is the continent where Europe and Asia are connected, the island of Australia, as well as to the Americas. Our early ancestors were considered hunters and gatherers whose survival depended upon the availability of not just wild plants but also animals. As the animals would migrate, so did our ancestors. Likewise, as the seasons changed, the availability of plants and the food that they produce would also either increase or decrease, and in turn, our ancestors had to move. One of the things that helped our ancestors survive was the development of culture. This allowed us to overcome the limitations that were set by the physical environment, whether it is the lack of food or the weather itself. Think about the culture that we have, whether it's language, the music we listen to, the clothes we wear, the TV shows we watch. All these things help us deal with everyday life. That is our culture. Now, on your notes, you have this map. What I would like for you to do with this map is, for one, identify the continent of Africa. According to scientific fact, Africa is where the oldest human remains have been found, particularly in eastern Africa. From there, our ancestors migrated into Asia, Europe, Australia. They used the land bridge that connected Asia to North America to cross into North America as they migrated south into Central and South America. What I'd like for you to do on this map is, again, draw a star in Eastern Africa and identify the routes that our early ancestors took to populate the earth. Now, keep in mind, this did not happen overnight. This took hundreds of thousands of years. So, I'm going to allow you to stop the video, pause the video, do the best you can, try your best. If you need to do some research, do some research, but I know you can do it. Now, this map is a little bit different than what your map looked like. Your map that you drew on was divided by the Pacific Ocean, whereas this map is divided by the Atlantic Ocean. But once again, you can see how the early ancestors start here in Africa. They migrate into Asia, Europe. They cross. This is the land bridge. The sea levels were a lot lower, exposing the land underneath, allowing the ancestors to come into the Americas. And when our ancestors reach the Americas, this will eventually become the Native Americans that we know, such as the Iroquois, the Black Hawk, the Cherokee, and so on and so forth. We will talk about native tribes that developed in Central America, like the Olmecs, the Toltecs, the Mayans. Eventually, their descendants would be the Aztec, and then in South America, they would populate and eventually develop cultures that we know of today as the Incas, which we'll talk later on about this year. You have two major time periods that we need to discuss. First is called the Paleolithic Age. The Paleolithic Age means old stone. During this time period, our ancestors had certain characteristics, and these characteristics were as follows. We were nomadic, meaning that we moved around from place to place. We followed the animals, we followed the seasons. We think about like the birds when they shift from their summer homes to the fall or winter homes, they fly south for the winter. Likewise, our ancestors also moved. Again, we were looking for food, water, as well as shelter to keep survival needs handy. We also developed in an old Stone Age, the Paleolithic Age, the first stone tools. These were very simple, basic tools and weapons. Not a whole lot of creativity here. You pick up a stick, you swing it. You pick up a rock and you throw it. Very, very simple. Some items that have been discovered are things like certain types of bones that have been carved and manipulated. As I said, a stick or a rock, a single item. Sometimes in the late Paleolithic Age, our ancestors started realizing that if you combine certain things, the weapons or tools will be more productive as well as effective in its use. Our ancestors also, during this time period of the Paleolithic Age, created and began to use fire. Now, fire is an element that's always been around, but it was during the Paleolithic Age that our ancestors realized how to recreate fire. And in doing so, there are a lot of uses and benefits. Think about things like cooking food. How does cooking food help us? How does staying warm help us? How would those ideas help our ancestors progress and evolve and survive? Our ancestors also lived in clans. Clans were small groups that were very mobile, and in doing so, we could follow the animals. So it's very easy for us to pack up and leave to follow the animals when they would migrate. But it was big enough, these clans were big enough to provide protection. So those are the benefits of being in a clan during the Paleolithic Age. Also, during the Paleolithic Age, the actual development of oral language, speaking, being able to speak is a huge breakthrough. Now, it might not be as sophisticated as English or other languages throughout the world. However, whistles, clicks, moans, groans, you name it, whatever those sounds originally were, the meaning behind it began what we would think of today as a language. Very interesting concept. What I like for my students to do when we talk about the Paleolithic Age is think about early humans. When a child is born, they do not know how to speak. They do not know what certain things are. They have to learn these things. So imagine what a child is like, what a child is like learning how to speak, learning how to say certain things, what certain things mean. That is what life was like for the Paleolithic Age. And last but not least, one of my personal favorites about the Paleolithic Age is cave art. Cave art to me is very fascinating. To me, it's a snapshot of what life was like hundreds of thousands of years ago. And so when we look at cave art, for instance, the image that you see here, what is it telling us? Think about that. What is that individual seeing? What is around them? What is in their environment? Why do you think it's important for them to draw this or paint this? Think about the materials that they would have used. How would they get that tint of a color? So, again, cave art, very fascinating. Here are a couple images of examples of cave art found throughout the world. And a couple questions I want you to think about. What are these two different things telling us? What are you seeing? What kind of patterns, what kind of imagery are you seeing? It could be literal. What are you actually seeing? Or could there be some meaning behind it? Very fascinating questions. And leave this slide with this thought. Our ancient ancestors have the ability to post pictures. Think about that. They post the pictures on their wall, kind of like how we post our pictures on our social media walls. Kind of interesting how history does tend to repeat itself, but in a different fashion. Eventually, we would evolve and change and develop what is called the Neolithic Age. The Neolithic Age actually stands for the New Stone Age. The Latin term neo means new. And it's during this time period when we create the idea of the agricultural or Neolithic revolution. A lot of people think revolution means war or conflict. In actuality, it just means change. And so, in this term, what happens here? It begins the idea of farming. When we start to farm, our ancestors no longer need to follow animals and look for plants, whether they settle down permanently, and this becomes a major breakthrough in advancement for civilization. Here are your basic characteristics of the Neolithic or New Stone Age. The obvious one is agriculture, the development of farming, the organization of placing seeds in rows in order to find food was a major breakthrough. You don't have to worry about going out and searching for it. You don't have to fear being attacked by wild animals or other clans competing for this food supply. It is right there, right outside your door. Domestication. Now, a lot of people, oh yeah, domestication, we know what that means. The ability to tame is what domestication means. Now, when we say domestication of plants, that kind of confuses students. How do you tame a plant? Stay there, corn. Potato, roll over. No. What we mean by domestication of plants is, again, as I mentioned with agriculture, taking something and placing it in an organized manner so that way you can easily harvest it when the time comes. Domestication of animals becomes very important as well. Domestication of animals allows our ancestors to have a steady supply of food. Not only that, but we can also start to have entertainment as well as, for instance, the ability to use animals for a supply of workforce. So pulling carts, plows, wagons become very useful. Taming of dogs helps with hunting. Hunting does not stop. As we know, here in the 21st century, people enjoy hunting. It becomes more of a recreational enjoyment type of thing instead of not necessarily a survival activity. So, agriculture and domestication are two major characteristics during the Neolithic Age. Other characteristics are advanced tools. We start to see where combining multiple items becomes very useful. Eventually, during the Neolithic Age, we start to see the use of metal, starting with copper, evolving to tin, and then realizing that if you combine copper and tin, that would make bronze. Bronze is stronger than tin and copper individually. So the evolution of metallurgy starts to develop during the Neolithic Age as well. These next two tend to be forgotten about: pottery as well as weaving. These two items become extremely important, and we still have these today. With pottery, simple things to store items, to transport items, becomes very useful. Think about all the crops that you harvest that produce seeds. You need a place to store them. You need a place for them to stay dry over the winter. Come the spring and early summer, you can plant again. So pottery becomes very important. The idea of weaving, as you see there in the bottom left, that's a loom. Someone's making a blanket or fabric. Becomes extremely important. Not only is it for to keep warm, but you can also use that for building materials, for roofs over your permanent structures, fences to keep the hogs from running loose or the chickens from running wild, or in protecting the chickens from other animals that wouldn't mind having a chicken dinner. So these are major characteristics you would see and be describing someone who lived during the Neolithic or the New Stone Age. We are at the last slide, and I really enjoy showing this image to the students in my class. What I'd like for you to do now is looking back over the Paleolithic and the Neolithic age, what characteristics do you see in this image? Now, one of the things I failed to mention earlier is as the Paleolithic age starts to end and the Neolithic age begins, those characteristics of the Paleolithic age don't die out. The Paleolithic age characteristics become the building blocks that still exist, even still to this day, that the Neolithic people built their culture upon. So, what I'd like for you to do is I would like for you to go through and I want you to find as many characteristics as you can. Thank you for watching. I hope you have learned a little bit more about the prehistoric peoples of the world, of the Paleolithic Age and the Neolithic Age. And hopefully you have been able to copy and fill in the notes that you are needed. And at this point in time, I'm going to end the video and conclude WHI.2 Prehistory Part 1.